All right, hello. Welcome to the Craft Talk video on form within poetry. That was my dog shaking. So form is the way a poem looks on the page. There are many established forms throughout poetic history, such as the sonnet or the haiku. There are even some newer ones that have come out of the past century, such as a found poem, in which the language within the poem comes from pieces of literature that already exist, kind of like a collage, or the Golden Shovel poem, where writers find a poem they really like and take the end word from each line and make those their end word in each of their lines, all while staying in the order of the original poem. But most writers today write in free verse, free form, whatever you'd like to call it. In that, there's no certain pattern or strict structure to the poem. While I encourage you guys to try out established forms, especially some of those newer ones, because those are pretty cool and could be great forms to use when you have writer's block or need somewhere to start, I think freeform allows us the most flexibility. To break it down, poetry is made of stanzas and lines. It's the main thing that separates poetry from prose. Stanzas are like the paragraphs of poems, and lines are like the sentences, although you write sentences in poetry. I promise it's much less complicated than it seems. Stanzas are made up of lines. A stanza can even be one line on its own. When you double tap that enter key is when you've broken the stanza and entered into a new one. Lines are the horizontal laying out of words. When you hit that enter key once, you've started a new line. Lines and sentences are not the same thing in poetry. You can extend a sentence beyond a line, which is called enjambment or through line. If you do end a line at the end of the sentence, that is called an end stop line. If that is the case, it's really, just in general, it's really important to keep punctuation in your poetry. There are some poets out there that don't use punctuation, but I think it's really important so we know when the end of a sentence is and when the end of a line is, because they differ. It's important to be intentional in all aspects of formatting. If the poem centers around the relationship between two people, it could opt to use couplet stanzas or 2 lines per each stanza, where the lines represent the people in the poem. If your poem is rather talky and braids a lot of ideas together, try the braided method, where you start the first line at the leftmost side of the page, then you hit enter, entering the new line, but you hit tab, begin writing the new line. This back and forth between traditional and manipulated indentation can create a braided-like feel to your poem. So it goes boom, 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 boom. This allows you to bounce between ideas in an easier, digestible way to the reader. Formatting lines is also crucial to pacing the poem. If you have a high-intensity moment in the piece, longer lines can increase the pace a reader reads the words. Shorter lines can slow down the pacing. I think if you have a more complicated idea that you're trying to give your reader, using shorter lines can break it down into digestible pieces. Think about if you've ever read something that is just really over your head and you don't understand it and the language is super academic-y. The meaning can get so lost behind the words that you have no clue what you just read and you have to go back and read it again. So by creating the line to be shorter, you're making that more complicated idea easier to grasp. Breaking a line is something that should always be intentional in a poem. Where you choose to break your line should mean something. Try to avoid ending on an article like she or it or when, one of those weaker words. Readers are automatically going to put pressure on whatever word you've chosen to end the line on, so give them something worthwhile. Additionally, you can break a line playfully in a way that adds double meaning to your word, called a double entendre. The word you end on within the line has a different connotation than the word's meaning in the sentence as a whole. For example, in this next excerpt from a poem, the speaker is talking directly to her deceased grandfather about her fears that had he still been living, he'd be disappointed in the person she'd become. Rather, she wants to stay in that perfect, innocent aura of the child she was when the grandfather passed. The poem's opening line states, "I think it's good when grandparents die." Yikes, that is a pretty harsh statement. But if you continue on to the next line, it reads, "While we are still young." Suddenly, the context has changed. The speaker doesn't declare death to all grandparents, but rather thinks it's better that grandparents only know the innocence they see within their grandchild. The line is broken in a way that creates 2 different meanings. I find smart line breaks super delicious as a reader because it shows that the poet is actively thinking about their form as well as their content. Sentence variety is also important to think about when crafting your poem. It's super exhausting to read long sentence after long sentence, even when they're broken up in lines. Short sentence after short sentence can make the meter jolty as well. So mix it up a bit. If you've been giving the reader a really long sentence, give them a shorter one to catch their breath on. Remember that longer lines and longer sentences, the reader will read at a faster pace. Short lines and short sentences will slow the reader down. White space is also something to think about when writing a poem. Indenting within a line can add some flavor. Blank space on a page can echo silence or a ghostly-like feeling. Something's missing, something's lost. There's something not there that the speaker desperately wishes there were. It's a bit more of an abstract concept, but I think the example poem I have chosen for the week exemplifies white space pretty well. Format can be a little bit confusing, and there's a lot of rules and regulations. Ultimately, what I'm telling you is what I have found works best. There's really no right way or right method to go about it, but these are just some tips and tricks that have worked well for me in the past.